Disney has adapted a wide range of stories and fairy tales in all different kinds of media. Film, television, records, print, and anything else you can think of. However, there are only a handful of stories that the public are familiar with, especially in regards to fairy tales. So, sometimes a story will get adapted multiple times. Take, for instance, Rapunzel, one of the more famous Grimm fairy tales, has been adapted countless times. Disney, of course, would make a fairly definitive version in 2010 with Tangled. However, did you know that this wasn't the first time they tackled the story? Today we'll be traveling back in time to discover what Disney's Rapunzel was like before Tangled. Side note, I'm gonna try to put some audio clips in this video, but I don't know if YouTube will like that. So if there are ever any weird gaps or jumps in this video, you'll know why. Okay, I've given enough introduction. Gather your greens and beware of evil witches as we journey through these stories together. Our first production came in 1962, in the form of a storybook record. These were really popular throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Hundreds of titles were published by Disneyland Records. Some were adaptations of any Disney property, films, television series, even theme park attractions, but others were based on non-Disney stories. This is the latter, a compilation of other fairy tales put onto one disc. Walt Disney presents Best Loved Fairy Tales. The stories were narrated by Rika Moore over, strangely enough, a freeform jazz backtrack.
There was once a prince, and he wanted a princess, but she must be a real princess.
The music was performed by Red Mitchell and Larry Bunker, both of whom were credited on the record, which was rare back in those days.
Now you must acquire a taste for freeform jazz.
Anyways, the record contained several different fairy tales, including Little Red Riding Hood, Rumpelstiltskin, and, yes, Rapunzel. The story is a fairly cut and dry retelling of the Brothers Grimm fairy tale, with no frills or additions. It even includes plot points that other versions cut out. Like it keeps the vegetable firstborn transaction between Rapunzel's parents and the witch. It even keeps the prince getting blinded.
The prince was so shocked that he fell backwards out of the window. He was not killed, but his eyes were scratched out by the thorns that grew where he fell.
It's often said that fairy tales are a lot darker than we give them credit for, and this record doesn't really shy away from it. The record as a whole is a rather unique take on these classic stories, especially from Disney. Upon hearing the Little Red Riding Hood story, Walt reportedly said that he wished they had made it themselves, and was pleasantly surprised to find out that it was a Disneyland record, which certainly speaks to the quality of it. If you can manage to get your hands on it or find a recording of it, I think it's worth checking out. But that's enough about that. On to the next one. In 1974, British publisher Purnell published an anthology of Disney stories titled Walt Disney's Giant Book of Fairy Tales. Many of them were standard Disney fare, their popular films and stories adapted into, let's say, a 5-minute long story, good to read to kids before bedtime. Those aren't the interesting parts, though. A good chunk of the book is other fairy tales and stories. Each of them starred other Disney characters playing different roles. Kinda like Mickey's Christmas Carol, I guess. And many of them are stories that would end up being adapted by Disney many years later. Here's Aladdin, Beauty and the Beast, The Frog Prince, The Little Match Girl, and so many more. Honestly, this book might be worth revisiting in a future video. I'm kinda fascinated by it. But for now, we'll be focusing on its version of Rapunzel. The story features Cinderella, I think, as Rapunzel, and Prince Philip from Sleeping Beauty as the prince. Yeah, that's something this book does a lot, mixing the princesses with other princes. Maybe the illustrator was a crack shipper. Anyways, the story is what you'd expect. There are some interesting departures from the Brothers Grimm story. In most versions, Rapunzel is taken by the witch as a baby. Here, she appears to still be a teenager, I think. The witch just thought her long hair was so pretty that she decided to kidnap her. In that way, it's closer to Tangled. Though, Mother Gothel had her locked in a tower for all of her childhood, as opposed to this story where Rapunzel's only imprisoned for a couple of months. But those are where the similarities stop. The rest of the story is fairly faithful to the original. Prince discovers tower, he climbs up, they bond, witch finds out, cuts her hair and kicks her out. I guess the hair wasn't that important after all. Though this prince gets off easier than the one from the Grimm story. Here, the witch just tells her that she's gone forever and he'll never find her again. No blinding here. But they get reunited and live happily ever after. Except for the witch who, and I quote, got into such a rage that she choked herself to death with anger. That's the last line of the story, by the way. Cheerful note to go out on. There isn't a ton more to say about this story. It is interesting that some of the deviations do align with the ones that Tangled made, with the witch kidnapping her for her hair and there being no greens transaction, but it doesn't really make enough alterations to be particularly noteworthy. Unless you're really interested in the Rapunzel story and want to see as many versions of it as you can, I'd say that this isn't really worth digging into. But again, this book might be worth revisiting in a future video, so if you want to see that, leave a comment. Moving on, here's a weird Disney piece of obscurity. The 1971 record, Walt Disney Presents Silly Symphonies. Don't let the title fool you, it has absolutely nothing to do with the Silly Symphony cartoon series. It's a collection of a bunch of random songs just strung together without much care or coherency. Some of the songs are related to Disney films. There's one about Lambert the Lion, there's one about Willie the Whale, but there are also a number of original songs in there too. Each one is a different kind of genre, some going for a more kid-friendly vibe, others more modern and poppy, at least modern for the time. Some of the songs are certainly better than others. This is what the Susie song sounds like. 'Cause I am a little blue, and Susie is my name, yes it is. Woof. Anyways, early on in the album, there's a song called Lonely for My Love, in parentheses, Rapunzel song. With music and lyrics by Tutti Camerata, who seems to have done a lot of work for Disney as a music producer, this song is sung from Rapunzel's point of view, I guess, and is her lamenting how lonely it is being locked in her tower. If we're going off of the Brothers Grimm story, then she's been there for her entire life and it's making her lonely. Maybe she's met the prince by this point and is just lamenting that he isn't around more often. I'm lonely, I'm lonely, I'm lonely. I'm lonely for my love. Comparing this to Tangled musically, it reminds me of something like I See the Light. But thematically, it's basically When Will My Life Begin? Though the similarities kind of stop there. In Tangled, Rapunzel was yearning for freedom. Here, she's yearning for her one true love. If there was something that demonstrated the clear divide between the classic and modern princess formula, it's comparing this song to Tangled. Lonely for My Love is a pretty ballad, sure, but had the parenthetical not been there, I don't think I would have made the connection to Rapunzel. I would have thought it was just another love ballad. The lyrics are vague enough to be about any kind of loneliness. I guess that's not out of the ordinary for Disney songs, but still worth bringing up. It doesn't have a lot of connections to the album as a whole. Like I said, these are just kind of a bunch of songs randomly strung together without much care or thought. I did take a listen to the rest of it, and I do think this is one of the standout tracks. But I don't know if I care about it or remember it if I hadn't been working on this video. It is what it is. If you're curious and want to listen to it for yourself, it's on Spotify. There's one more pre-Tangled Rapunzel, an old See Hear Read record from the 70s. However, there isn't a lot to say about it. It's a pretty cut and dry retelling of the Brothers Grimm story. But those were just a few Disney Rapunzels, all predating Tangled by at least 4 decades. They all had a separate take on the story, going in pretty different directions. But how do they compare to the story they'd tell years later? Well, it shows how much Tangled altered to make the story work in a feature film. When you stick with just the bare bones of the Rapunzel story, there isn't a whole lot there. The title character doesn't even have a big part or a lot of agency in it. Part of what makes Tangled so remarkable is the changes it made. It turned a simple kidnapped princess narrative into an exploration of emotionally abusive parents and how it affects the child, which is infinitely more interesting and more relatable to audiences. It changes a regular prince into a wannabe rogue, and shows how he redeems himself from a life of crime. It changes things when necessary and pluses themes that were already there. When you think about it, that's what all the classic Disney fairy tales do best. Taking what was already kinda there and making it stronger. For as much flack as the studio gets for watering down stories, I don't think it's quite that black and white. Sure, there's a reason why Disneyfication is a phrase, but it isn't always like that. Sometimes they add to the story and make it more than it was before. Tangled is a great example of that. And when you compare it to these retellings we talked about today, you can certainly see why. Not that any of them are bad, I enjoyed going through all of them, but they are basic and simple. While that works for a record or a book, you need that extra something if you want to adapt it into a film. It goes to show that when you have a talented team of writers and filmmakers, you can really make any kind of story work. But these other versions are still fun to look back on, seeing what they used to be, and comparing them to more modern things. And that concludes the video. Now I'll pass the question off to you. What do you make of all of this? Were you familiar with any of these versions before this video? Would you like to see me do more topics like this in the future? What's your opinion on Tangled and how Disney adapted the Rapunzel story? Whatever your thoughts, let me know down in the comments. If you'd like to support the show, please consider hitting up my Patreon or Ko-fi page. If not, then be sure to like and subscribe to see more of my stuff. But that's all the time I've got for today. Thank you so much for watching as always, and I will talk to you guys soon. Take care.